Alex Rider, Chapter 6, 9 frames per second. Alex was glad to be home. Jack was there waiting for him, surrounded by presents that she'd bought in the American sales. Alex sometimes wondered what people made of the two of them, living together the way they did, with her baggy clothes, her wild red hair, and her constant smile. Jack was more like a big sister than a housekeeper, and although she was actually his legal guardian, she never nagged him or told him off. They were really just friends, and Alex knew that. He couldn't have got through the last year without her. She knew what he was doing. She had tried to talk him out of it, but she had never stood in his way. She'd brought him new jeans, 2 shirts, and Washington Redskins football, and a set of pencils from the White House. And over their first dinner together, he told her what happened at Notch Arcade, but with no mention of any sniper. He had decided not to worry her. "I just don't believe it," Jack exclaimed. "You go off on a nice New Year's Eve party and you end up 20 meters under a frozen lodge. Only you could manage that." "It wasn't my fault," Alex protested. "I wasn't driving. You know what I mean. How's Edward? How's Sabina?" "They're okay. They were shaken up. We were all. I'm not surprised. Do you know how it happened?" Alex hesitated. The one thing he wasn't going to do was lie to Jack. "Nobody's quite sure. They haven't got the car out yet. It's possible they never will. But Edward thinks one of the tires blew out. He felt something just before he lost control." "And what about the man who helped you?" "He didn't hang around. He didn't even wait to be thanked." Alex wouldn't have mentioned the accident at all, but he knew it would come out of a week end when he and Jack went to Heathrow Airport to say goodbye to Sabina and her parents. It was an uneasy last meeting. The 5 of them standing together, hemmed in by the crowds in suitcases and bright lights of Terminal 3. "We'll see you again in spring," Edward Pleasure said, reaching out and shaking Alex's hand. "We've got a spare room and we can head down the coast. I'm sure you'll enjoy trekking in Yosemite, or we could stay on a Big Sur." Sabina's mother gave him a hug. "I know what you did," she said quietly. "Sabina told me Edward would still be in that car if it hadn't been for you." Alex said nothing. For some reason, it always embarrassed him being thanked. "I hope you come and see us. And you too, Jack. Maybe you should come over together." And then it was Sabina's turn. She and Alex moved a little to one side. "Bye, Alex." "Bye, Alex." "Bye, Sabina. I thought you were brilliant in the car. When I started to swim up the surface, I was sure I was going to die. But I knew my dad would be all right because you'd promised you'd looked after him. It seems that every time I'm with your family, something bad happens." And I said it was true. In Cornwall, the south of France, and now in Scotland, sudden violence had never been far away. "Will you come to San Francisco?" "There'll probably be an earthquake or something." I don't mind. I still want to see you." Sabina's glanced at her parents. They were standing with their backs to her, talking to Jack. She quickly leaned forward and kissed Alex on the cheek. And suddenly the 3 of them were picking up their hand luggage and making their way through it to passport control and the security checks. Sabina looked around one last time and waved. Then they were gone. The next day, Alex went back to school, and the Christmas holidays were forgotten in a whirl of timetables. Textbooks, new teachers, old friends. Brookland was a sprawling, mixed, comprehensive, half a mile north of Chelsea. It had only been built about 10 years ago, and it prided itself on its modern architecture with double-height windows and bright primary colours. At the same time, though, it still had an old-fashioned, friendly feel. Everyone wore uniforms, sober shades of blue and grey. The school had a motto, and it was even in Latin, "Pergo e perago," which sounded like the story of 2 Italian cannonballs, but which actually meant, "I try and I achieve." No running in the corridor, Alex. Miss Bedfordshire, the school secretary, greeted Alex with one of her favourite phrases. Even though Alex had been walking quite quickly, she had stepped out of the classroom, blocking this path. Hi, Miss Bedfordshire. It's good to see you. Did you have a nice Christmas? Yes, thanks. And do you plan to stay with us for the whole term? It would certainly make a change. Alex had recently been away at almost as much as he'd been at school. Miss Bedfordshire had always had her doubts about the signs of strange illness that had been listed on the doctor's notes. I hope so, he said. Maybe you should eat more food. You know, an apple a day. I'll give it a try. And he hurried on his way, aware that the secretary was watching him as he went. Sometimes he wondered how much she really knew. And then there were 20 minutes catching up with the usual crowd. Tom Harris was late as always and looked incredibly scuffy in a new uniform that was one size too big for him. His parents had recently got divorced and he had spent the Christmas holidays with his elder brother in Naples. Alex had got to know the both when he come up against Scorpio for the first time, and Tom was the only one in school who was aware of his involvement with MI6. There were a couple of girls with him, and they all piled in the sports half-year group assembly. This began as unusual with him, which the TED teacher, Miss Bray, insisted on. Even though with every other school in the area had jacked it in, there were 300 of them packed into the hall, and they were horribly out of tune. The last chords faded away, and everyone sat down to listen to an uplifting speech, which, as usual, went up too long. This time it was all about respect. Respect for others, respect for yourself, above all, respect for the community. I noticed that Tom was listening intently with one hand resting against the side of his head. Only he could see the white wires of an iPod trailing back down the other boy's sleeve, and a faint tish-ta-ta-tish, coming from his ear. Then it was on to school business. Mr. Bray introduced a new class tutor and mentioned a couple of teachers who were leaving. One last thing, he announced. I am very happy to tell you that my science block is finally open. Again, after the mysterious fire, we did so much damage last year. I shifted uncomfortably. He had been at the very centre of the fire and knew exactly what had caused it. He was glad that Tom wasn't listening. Watching Alex squirm and knowing as much about him as he did, his friend might have put two and two together. I hope you all enjoy the new facilities. I wish you were all hard-working and successful, and I wish you were all a hard-working and successful term. The assembly finished and lessons began. For Alex, that meant history followed by maths and then PE, a cheerful assortment for the morning of the first day of term. After lunch, the first lesson of the afternoon was geography, with Mike Gilbert, a young teacher who had only arrived the term before. He was curly-haired with glasses and specialized in bright-colored ties. He hadn't been teaching enough to lose his enthusiasm, and it had been he who had sent the class project on genetic engineering that Alex had described in Scotland. It was part of the year's work on resources and food. I hope you've all thought a little about this very serious subject. He began. I'm going to want to see your written work completed by half term, and I've got some good news for you. Good news. He picked up a letter and showed it to the class. At the end of the term, at the end of last term, I wrote to the Greenfields Biocentre in Wiltshire. I'm sure you know who they are. They're always in the news. Greenfields is a private organisation, one of the world's leaders in plant science and microbiology. They've been doing more than anyone else to develop new sequence techniques in genetic engineering, and they've got a huge facility on the edge of Salisbury's Bury Plain. I asked if we could visit, look at their work, and maybe talk to some of their professors, And to my surprise, they've agreed. To be honest with you, I didn't think they'd allow school visits because so much of their work is secret, but we'll be heading down there next week. We'll need permission from your parents, and I'll hand out forms at the end of the lesson. Don't forget to get them signed. He put the letter down and went over to the board. Now, I want to find out how you're getting on with your projects. But first of all, I asked you to come up with some of the pros and cons of GM crops. Can anyone give me an example of how this science has helped associate GM crops? I couldn't help himself. He remembered the moment he had told Edward Pledge about his homework, just as Desmond McCain had come downstairs, and suddenly he was back at Kilmore Castle. Half an hour before New Year, McCain had been alarmed about something, but what was it? And could it really have led to the gunshot and the near death in Loch Arkaig? There had been no gunshot. I had to put the idea out of his head. The car had blown a tire. That was all. And yet he still remembered McCain, the gleaming bold head, the silver cross, the strange lines where the two halves of his face failed to meet. No, this was crazy. McCain ran a charity. He had made a mistake in his life, but it had paid for it. He wasn't a killer. Ryder? He had his name, realized it had been called out twice, and forced himself to focus back on his class, just as he feared. Mr. Gilbert had asked him something, but he hadn't even heard the question. He had been miles away. I'm sorry, sir, he said. Mr. Gilbert sighed. You don't turn up to school very often, Ryder. But it would be nice if you actually listened when you did. How? James Hal, another of Alex's friends, a neat-looking boy with brown hair and blue eyes, sitting at the desk. He glanced up apologetically and at Alex and then answered, GM science can the crops grow extra vitamins, he said. And there was a special sort of the rice that was changed so that it could grow underwater for a few weeks without dying. That's right. Obviously, it was very useful in countries with too much rainfall. Anyone else? Alex made sure he concentrated until the end of the lesson. The first day of term was far too early to get into trouble. Somehow he made it to 3:45 without further incident, and then he was part of the crowd pouring out of the school gates, his backpack over his shoulder. Once he hadn't brought his bike with him. Alex owned a Commodore Junior Road Racer which had been built for him as a 12th birthday present, but he noticed recently that it wasn't giving him a comfortable ride. The truth was that he was growing out of it, and the saddle wouldn't adjust anymore. He would be sorry to see it go. It belonged to his old life before his uncle had died. There was a precious little of that left. Perhaps it was thinking of his uncle that drove Alex to take a shortcut across Brompton Cemetery. This is where Iron Ryder had been buried after the so-called car accident that had killed him. It was at the funeral that Alex had begun to learn the truth about his uncle, that he had never worked in a bank, that he had lived and died as a spy. And Alex often walked through the cemetery, but today, acting on impulse, he left the main path and went over to the gravestone. He looked at the name carved in a square slab on grey marble, with the dates below it in a single line. A good man taken before his time. Well, that was one way of putting it. Someone had left flowers quite recently, roses. The petals were dead, but there was still a little colour in the leaves. Who had been here? Jack. And if it wasn't her, why hadn't he mentioned it to him? Alex bent down and brushed plants to one side. He thought about the man who had looked after him all his life, but who had been gone now for almost a year. He could still see Iron Ryder halfway up the mountain on a dive boat, in full scuba diving gear, or racing on jet skis around the Bahamas. He had taken Alex all over the world, always challenging him, pushing him to the limit. Adventure holidays, he had called them, and now Alex could have known that all the time he was being trained, being prepared to follow in his uncle's footsteps had brought him here. Alex Ryder! They must have crept up behind him while he was crouching beside the grave, and even without looking up, Alex knew he was in trouble. There was something about the voice, it's soft and threatening, with a slight Freudian inflection. Somehow the head of Snakehead gang that Alex had helped break up Dylan had reached out from wherever the hell had been sent to. He had left the instructions for revenge. Major U is dead. And he said, You killed him? You killed him? No, the last time I saw him, he was running away. If he's dead, that's the best thing that's ever happened to him. But it had nothing to do with me. You're lying. What difference does it make? He's finished. The whole thing's over. Coming after me isn't going to bring him back. You must pay for what you did. That's why we're here. They will just make their moves. Alex was almost see their knives jabbing forward, striking at his stomach and chest. They would leave him in the cemetery, bleeding to death. And the next funeral that took place here would be his. But he wasn't going to let that happen. Alex acted first. He was still holding the dead roses that had been clearing from his uncle's grave. He could feel the sharp thorns sticking in his palm of his hand. Swinging his arm up, Alex threw them, scattering them across the first man's face. For a second the man was blinded in pain, the thorns cutting into him. A single dead rose was hanging under one eye. Alex sprang up, then followed with a powerful back kick. The ball of his foot rounded the man's stomach. The man's eyes widened and he crumbled, gasping for breath. They just left too. They were already lunging towards him. Alex had to get out of their range, and there was only one way. His hand came down on Iron Rose's gravestone, and he cartwheeled over it, landing on the ground just behind. He needed a weapon, and he snatched up the only one he could see, the stone angel from the grave next to his uncle. He hoped the much-missed granddad wouldn't mind. The angel was heavy. Alex swung it round and hurled it at the second man, the one who hadn't spoken. It hit him in the face, breaking his nose. Blood poured out over the man's lips, and he reeled away, howling. The last of the three men swore in Chinese and launched himself towards Alex, the knife sweeping in great arcs, cutting at the air. Alex fled, with his attacker getting closer all the time. He ran across 6 of the graves, then leaped over the open trench. But the moment he landed, he stopped and turned round. The man who had almost jumped was taken completely by surprise. He had expected Alex to keep running. Instead, Alex had both feet firmly planted on the ground while he was in mid-air. There was nothing he could do as Alex laughed out with a front jab. Kizamizuki. He had been taught in karate, leaning with all his weight forward for maximum reach. Alex first caught the man in the throat. The man's eyes went white and he plunged down like a stone, disappearing into the grave. He hit the mud at the bottom and lay still. The first man was on his knees, wheezing, barely able to breathe. The second was still bleeding. Alex alone was unhurt. So what should he do? Call the police on his mobile? No. The last thing he wanted now was a load of tricky questions. She went back to Iron Driver's grave, snatched up his backpack and walked away. But even as he left, there were some questions of his own nagging at his mind. If Major Yu had given orders for him to be killed, why hadn't they just gone ahead and done it? They could have tiptoed up behind him and stabbed him. Why had they felt the need to announce themselves? And for that matter, why had none of them been carrying a gun? Wouldn't that have made the whole thing easier? As Alex left the centimeter, he didn't see the fourth man 50 meters away, hiding behind one of the Victoria mausoleums. This was a European, or perhaps an American, with fair hair down to his neck, smiling to himself as he watched Alex through the 135mm telephoto lens that was attached to the Nikon D3 digital SLR camera. He had taken more than 100 shots of the encounter, clicking away at the rate of 9 frames per second. When he took a few more, just for good measure, click, Alex dusting himself down, click, Alex turning away, click, Alex heading down for the main grate. He had it all recorded. It was perfect. Might have been chewing gum, but now he took it all out of his mouth, rolled into a ball and pressed against one of the gravestones. Click, one final shot at Alex leaving the centimeter, and the whole thing was in the bag. Chapter 7. Bad news. Alex was having dinner with Jack when the doorbell rang. "Are you expecting anyone?" she asked. No, the doorbell sounded again, longer and more insistent. Jack put down her knife and frowned. "I'll get it," she said. But why would anyone call it this time of night? It's 7:30 in the evening. Alex had got in, changed, done his homework, and had a bath. He was sitting at the kitchen table of the Chelsea home that had once belonged to Iron Ryder, which he and Jack now shared. He was wearing jeans and sweatshirt. His hair was still damp and his feet was bare. Jack liked to call herself a 10-minute cook, because that was the maximum amount of time she spent preparing a meal. And tonight she had served a homemade fish pie. Alex suspected that she had cheated on the time. He felt guilty. He hadn't told her yet about the fight at the thermometer. About the fight at the party, partly because he knew what she would say. There was no way he could keep something like that from her, but nor did he want to ruin the evening. He had been about to bring it up when the doorbell rang. His voice out in the hall, a man speaking, polite but insistent. Jack was arguing. There was a pause, and Jack returned on her own. I could see that she was concerned. "There's someone here who wants to see you," she said. "Who is it?" He says his name is Harry Bowman. Alex shook his head. "I've never heard of him." "Then let me introduce myself." A man had appeared at the kitchen door behind Jack, strolling into the room, looking around him at the same time. He was in his 30s, with long beach blonde hair falling in a tangle, broad shoulders and a thick neck. He was handsome, but not quite handsome as he thought. There was an arrogance about him that apparent in every move he made. Even the way he followed Jack in, he was dressed smartly in grey slacks, a blazer and a white shirt open at the collar. He had a gold chain around his neck and a gold signet ring which says HB on his third finger. For Alex, it was as if he stepped out of an advertisement for clothes, or perhaps toothpaste. This was a man who enjoyed being himself and wanted to sell his talents to the world. Jack spun round. Jack spun round. "I don't remember inviting you in. Please, don't ask me to wait outside. If you want the truth, I've been waiting for this moment for quite a long time." He looked past Jack. "It's a great pleasure to meet you, Alex." Alex slid his stood aside. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Do you mind if I sit down?" You don't need to sit down, Jack growled. "You're not staying long. You might change your mind when you hear what I've got to say." The man sat down at the head of the table opposite Harry. "My name is Harry Bowman," he said. I'm sorry I've come around so late, but I know you're at school, Alex, at Brooklyn, and I wanted to catch you while you both were in." "Alex, what do you want?" Alex asked. "Well, right now I could murder a bear if there's one going." Nobody moved. "Okay, I'll get to the point. I've come here to speak to you, Alex. As a matter of fact, although you won't believe it, I want your help. I hope the two of us are going to see quite a lot of each other. I think we're going to become friends." I don't need any help," I said. Horowitz smiled. His teeth were as white as his shirt. "You haven't heard what I've got to say." "Then why don't you get on with it?" Jack cut in. "Because we're having supper and we didn't want to be disturbed." "Smells good." Bowman drew a business card out of his wallet and slid it across the table. Jack came over and sat next to Alex. They both read it. There was the name, Harry Bowman, and beneath it, his job description, freelance journalist. There was also an address number in the North London and a telephone number. "You work for the press?" Jack said. Bowman nodded. "The Mirror, the Express, the Mail. If you ask around, you'll find I'm well known." "What are you doing here?" Alex asked. "You said you could help me. I don't need a journalist." "As a matter of fact, you do." Bowman took out a packet of chewing gum. "Do you mind? I've given up smoking, and I find that filmed this house." He unwrapped a piece and curled it in his mouth. "This is a nice place you've got here." "Please get on with it, Mr. Bowman." Alex could hear that Jack was running out of patience, but the journalist had already wrong-footed them twice. He had simply walked in here, and for a moment neither of them was asking him to leave. "All right, let's cut to the chase." Bowman rested his elbows on the table and leant forward. "More journalists have a specialist specialist area. It might be food, football, politics, whatever. My speciality is intelligence. I spent 6 years in the military. I was in the commandos, and I hung on to my old contacts when I left. I figured they might come in handy. I was actually thinking about writing my book, but that didn't work out, so I started touching myself around the newspapers, the broadsheets as well as the red tops. MI5, MI6, CIA, any bit of gossip I managed to pick up. I'd string together as a story. I wasn't going to make me rich, but I did okay. Alex and Jack was listening to this in silence. None of them liked the way it was going. And then a couple of months ago, I began to hear the strange rumours. They started with an event that took at the Science Museum last April, when Horowitz was about to launch his Stormbreaker computer system. What happened to the Stormbreakers, by the way? There was going to be one in every school in the country, but suddenly they were recording. That was that. They were never seen again. Anyway, back to the Science Museum. It seems that an agent of MI6 Special Operations, parachuted through the roof and took a shot at Sale. No names, no pack drill, nothing unusual about that. But then I was talking to a mate in the pub, told me the bloke on the head parachute wasn't a man at all. It was a boy. He swore to me that Special Operations had gone out and recruited a 14-year-old boy, and that was just the latest secret weapon. Of course, I didn't believe it at first, but I decided to have a nose around, and so I started asking questions. Do you know what? It turned out to be true. MI6 had taken some poor bloody kid, trained him up with the SIS in the Lake District, and sent him out on active service no fewer than 3 times. It took me a while to find out the name of this boy Wonder in the SAS, and he was known as Cub. But I persisted. I'm not so bad at this job, and in the end I got what I wanted. Alex Ryder, that's you. Don't know what you're talking about. Alex said, You're making a mistake, Mr. Bowman. Jack added, You saw this is ridiculous. Alex is still at school. Alex is still at Brookland. Bowman agreed. But according to the school secretary, a very nice lady called Miss Bedfordshire, he's been away an awful lot recently. Don't blame her, by the way. She didn't know I was a journalist. I was pretending I was calling from the local council, but let me see. Woman took out a notebook. You were away for the first time last March. You were also away in November, at exactly the same time that a teenager boy dropped in on an oil rig in the Timor Sea, fighting alongside the Australian SAS. And who was that kid at Heathrow Airport when DeMay and Cray had a nasty accident in a jumbo jet? Now there's a funny thing, isn't it? An international pop star and multi-millionaire. 1 minute he's in perfect health, the next we're being told he's had a heart attack. Well, I suppose I'd have a heart attack if someone pushed me into the turbine of a plane. Bullman snapped the notebook shut. Nobody's been allowed to write anything about any of this. National security and all the rest of it. But I've spoken to the people who were at the Science Museum at Heathrow and in Australia. He fixed his eyes on Alex, and they've all described you. There was a long silence. Jack's fish pie had gone cold. Alex was stunned. He had always supposed MI6 would protect him from publicity. He had never expected a journalist to turn up at his home. Jack was first to speak. You've got it all wrong, she said. Alex took a bit of time off last year because he was sick. You can't possibly think. Please don't treat me like an idiot, Jack. Bowman cut in, and suddenly there was a steel in his voice. I've done my homework. I know everything. Why don't you stop wasting time and face up to the facts? He reached in the second pocket and took out a bundle of photographs. Alex winced. He knew what he was coming in before the journalist spread them on the table. And he was right. The pictures had been taken just a few hours earlier in Brompton Cemetery. They showed Alex in action against the 3 men who had attacked him, kicking out in one frame, spinning over the gravestone in another. When were these taken? Jack asked. She was obviously shaken. This afternoon, Alex replied. They followed me from school and came up to me in the cemetery. He looked accusingly at Bowman. You set it all up? The journalist nodded. Believe me, Alex, they weren't going to hurt you, but I had to be the one, 100% certain. I wanted to see you in action for myself. And I have to say, you more than lived up to your reputation. In fact, I'm going to have to pay the guys double what I promised them. You put two of them in hospital. Oh, and there's something you should listen to. Bowman produced a miniature digital voice. We called him, pressed the button, Once Alex heard his own voice, a little tiny and distant, but definitely him. Major U is dead. Major U is dead. You killed him? No, the last time I saw him, he was running away. All three of them were wired for sound. Bullman flicked the machine off. You know all about Snakehead, so don't play innocent with me. But by the way, I never found out how Major U died. I'd be interested to know how it happened. And I answered, Jack, I wrote you there with no point denying it anymore. What exactly do you want? Well, we saw that with the beer I was talking about. Jack stiffened. Then she stood up, went to the fridge and took out a can of beer. She gave it to the journalist without a glass, but he didn't seem to mind. He cracked it open and drank. Thank you, Jack, he said. Look, I can tell you both a bit thrown by this, and I can understand all that. You've got to remember what I said when I first came in. I'm on your side. In fact, I want to help you. Help me? How? By telling your story. The woman held up a hand before Alex could interrupt. Wait a minute. Just hear me out. He had obviously rehearsed what he was about to say. First of all, I think what he was about to say. First of all, I think that's happened. What happened to you was an outrage. It's more than that. It's a national scandal. In case you haven't noticed, the law says that you can't join the army until you're 16. So the idea of that MI6 could stroll along and use a kid like you is quite frankly beggars belief. Did you volunteer? Do you volunteer? I said nothing. It doesn't matter. We can come to this all later. We can come to that later. But here's the point. When this gets out, heads are going to roll. The way I see it, you're the victim in all this, Alex. Don't get me wrong, you're also a hero. If even half what I've heard about you is true, then what you've done is absolutely amazing. But it should never have been allowed to happen. And I think these people are going to be horrified when the story breaks. The story will never break, Jack. They might let you write it. I'm sure they'll try to stop me. But this is the 21st century, Jack. It's not easy anymore. You can think the Americans wanted anyone to know about the torture practices carried out in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, or what happened to all the British MPs who were trying to hide their crooked expenses. They're no secrets anymore. If they stop me going to the newspapers, I can put it on the internet, and once the story's broken, the press will come running. You see, if we keep in exclusive, if we go to Sunday Times or the Telegraph, we'll clean up. But it's not just about newspapers. The way I see it, there's a book in this. It shouldn't take more than 3 months to write it, and it shouldn't take more than 3 months to write it, and it'll sell all over the world. I'm telling you, Blair was offered £6 million for the memoirs, which nobody even wanted to read, and I reckon we can make 10 times that amount. Then there'll be significant in the world press, exclusive interviews. Oprah Winfrey alone will pay $1 million, and almost certainly a bidding war for the rights to make a major Hollywood film. You're going to be the most famous person in the world, Alex. Everyone is going to want a piece of you. And who gets the money? Jack asked. She already knew the answer. We have come to an agreement, Jack. Whatever you may think of me, I'm not greedy, and there's not going to be more than enough to go around. 50-50. Alex will tell me the full story and I'll write it down. I've got all the contacts, publishers, lawyers, that sort of thing. I'd like to be Alex's manager. And I promise you I'll look after him. Like I said, I'm a fan. And after what he's been through, he deserved to rake it in. When I hit, MI6 hadn't even paid him a salary. Now, salary. Now that's what I call exploitation. Suppose I'm not interested. And I said, suppose I don't want a story to be told. Bullman drank more of his beer. The chewing gum was still in his mouth. It's too late for that now, Alex, he explained. It's going to happen anyway. The story's out there and someone will write it. Even if you don't, if you sit back and refuse to cooperate, it'll only make it worse. You'll have to live with what people say about you, and you will get a chance to tell your side. But in a way, if you don't mind me saying so, you're lucky you got me in the driving seat. You think anyone else would offer you equal partnership? In fact, most hacks would have just gone ahead and broken the news without even coming here. I can imagine you're probably a bit confused right now. I'm sorry that I pulled a stunt on you in the cemetery, but believe me, once you get to know me better, we're going to be friends. I am a professional. I know what I'm doing. Bullman finished his beer and crumbled the can. Alex didn't know what to say. Too many thoughts were going through his head. Fortunately, Jack took over. "Thank you for being so frank with us," she said. "But if you don't mind, we'd like some time to think about what you just said." "Of course, I can understand that. You have my number. I can give you it to the end of the week." Boy stood up. I reckon it will be quite fun, Alex. I'll come here every evening and we'll talk for a couple of hours, and I'll write it up the next day while you're at school. You can read it read it at weekends." She just did the photographs. "You can hang on to those. I've got copies." He went over to the door, then turned round one last time. "I meant what I said, Alex. You're a real hero, Alex. I hope I made that clear from the start. There aren't many boys your age who actually believe in their country. You're a patriot, and I respect the way that. I'm really privileged to have met you." He waved a hand. Don't get up. I'll show myself out." And then he was gone. Neither Jack nor Alex said anything until they had heard the front door close. Then Jack went out to make sure the journalist really had left. I say where he was. He was in shock. He was trying to think about what it all meant. He would become world famous. There was no doubt of that. His photograph would be on all the newspapers and magazines. And he would never be able to walk down the street again, not without being pointed out as some sort of curiosity, a freak. He would have to leave Brookland, of course. He might even have to leave the UK. He could say goodbye to his home, to his friends, to any chance of a normal life. He felt a black anger welling up inside him. How could he allow this to happen? Jack came back into the room. He's gone, he said. She sat down at the table. Photographs were still spread out in front of her. "Why didn't you just tell me about the cemetery?" she asked. There was no accusation in her voice, but Alice knew she was upset. "I was going to," he said, "but it happened so soon after Scotland that I thought you'd be worried. I'd be more worried if I thought you weren't telling me what you were in trouble. So I'm sorry, Jack. It doesn't matter." Jack gathered in the photographs into a pile and placed them face down. He wasn't quite as clever as he thought. He said. "He didn't know everything about you. He'd only found out 3 of your missions. And he said you trained in the Lake District. He got that wrong too." "He knew enough," Alex said. "So what are we going to do? We can't let him write this story. Alex felt a hollow in his chest. "He doesn't care about me. He just wants to use me. He's going to ruin everything." Jack reached out and touched his hand. "Don't worry, Alex. We'll stop him." "How?" Alex thought for a moment, then asked his own question. "We're going to have to go and see Mr. Blunt." It was the only course of action. They both knew it. There was no other options. Don't like going back there. Every time you set foot in that place, something bad comes out of it. Jack was only saying what Alex was thinking. "I was beginning to think they've forgotten all about you. This will just remind them." "I know. But who else is going to stop him?" "Jack, we need their help." "They've never helped you before, Alex. This time it's in their interest. They're not going to want Harry Bowman writing about them." Alex pushed his plate away. He had barely eaten, but he no longer had any appetite. "I'll go after school tomorrow." "I'll come with you." "Thanks." He was going back. The decision had been made. But as Alex got up and helped clear the table, he wondered if in the truth he had ever really left.